Have you ever noticed that no matter how carefully you manage your money, the gap between where you are and where you want to be never actually closes? You cut the coffee. You track every expense. You do everything the advice tells you to do, and somehow you're still one unexpected bill away from panic. It feels unfair, doesn't it? But here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Money was never a reward for good behavior. It was never going to notice your discipline and hand you a prize. Money moves toward those who understand one uncomfortable rule. Every financial relationship is a negotiation. And in every negotiation, one side ends up as prey. The only question is which side you've been playing. The wealthy don't budget their way to power. They don't wait for permission. And they don't trust the rules they were handed as children. They read the terrain before they ever signed anything. And they've been reading it since long before you even knew there was anything to read. If you don't learn to see the game the way they see it, you'll spend your entire life defending a small patch of ground while they quietly take everything around you. Somewhere out there tonight, a young man is living exactly this. He is sitting at a kitchen table with a notebook open in front of him. He has written down his income on one line and his expenses on another, and he is staring at the small gap between them, as if that gap is the entire story of his life. It isn't. That gap is not the story. It's the scoreboard of a game he was never taught the rules to. And no man wins a game whose rules were written by someone else, in secret, decades before he was born. He has done everything he was told to do. He finished school. He took the job. He avoided the obviously reckless decisions his friends made in their 20s. And yet the gap on his page has barely moved in years, no matter how carefully he manages it. No matter how many small comforts he denies himself in the name of discipline, he assumes the fault is his. It rarely occurs to him to ask whether the game itself was ever designed to close that gap at all, or whether it was quietly designed to keep it exactly where it is, indefinitely, for reasons that have nothing to do with him personally. Real power was never accumulated by people who tracked their coffee spending. It was accumulated by men who understood one brutal, ancient truth. Money is not managed. Money is conquered. And conquest is rules that have nothing to do with coupons, nothing to do with willpower, and nothing to do with the comfortable lies whispered to children about hard work being enough. Sun Tzu never wrote about savings accounts. Machiavelli never lectured princes about emergency funds. They wrote about terrain, timing, deception, and the calculated destruction of weaker positions. And if you strip away the swords and the armies, what's left is exactly the map the wealthy still use today. They just don't call it war anymore. They call it strategy. They call it the market. They call it opportunity. But underneath the language, it's the same old game. Territory, resources, advantage, blood, just quieter, just slower, just wearing a suit instead of armor. So let's stop pretending personal finance is a math problem. It was never a math problem. It's a war you've been fighting unarmed, against people who've been training since childhood, using a rule book you were never shown, on a battlefield you were never told existed. Tonight, you get the rule book. Understand something before we go further. This is not a metaphor invented to make finance sound exciting. It is a literal description of how power has always moved through the world. Every empire that ever rose did so by identifying weakness, exploiting timing, and refusing sentiment the moment sentiment threatened the mission. Every empire that ever fell did, so the instant it forgot that lesson and mistook comfort for security. The same law that governed the fall of Carthage governs a man's bank account tonight. Scale changes. Principle never does. The first truth: you cannot win a war you refuse to name. Here is the first thing that separates the predator from the prey. The prey believes life is fair, that hard work is noticed, that the system rewards effort in proportion to how much of it is given. The predator believes none of that, and he is right not to. The predator assumes correctly that every financial relationship, every job offer, every loan, every subscription, every deal is a negotiation between two parties with fundamentally different interests. One party wants your time. One party wants your loyalty. One party wants your money moving through their hands before it ever moves through yours. You were taught to trust the terms. The predator reads the terms twice, then asks a colder question. Who profits if I fail to understand this? That single question is the beginning of strategic thinking. Machiavelli understood that a ruler who assumes good faith from every actor around him is already defeated before the first move is made. He hasn't been outfought. He's been outfreed. The world does not punish you for having enemies. It punishes you for refusing to admit that you have any. Think about the last contract you signed without reading past the highlighted line. A phone plan, a gym membership, a loan. Somewhere in that document, someone paid a lawyer a great deal of money to write a sentence you would never bother to find. That sentence was not written for you. It was written against you, quietly, in language engineered to be skimmed and forgotten. This is not a conspiracy. It's simply what happens when one side treats a transaction as war, and the other side treats it as a formality to get through as quickly as possible. The young man at the kitchen table doesn't know this yet. He believes the bank approved his loan because they believed in him. He believes the credit card company raised his limit because he earned it. He has never once asked the coldest and most useful question a man can ask about money. What does the other side of this table actually want from me? And have I given it to them for free? Strategy 1. Reconnaissance before commitment. No general marches into unfamiliar territory without scouts. Yet most people accept a job offer, a mortgage, an investment, a business partnership, with less research than they would put into buying a used car. They walk onto the battlefield blind, trusting a smile and a signature line, and they call this trust a virtue instead of what it actually is, an unguarded flank. The predator's ledger begins before the first transaction ever takes place. It begins with intelligence. Who controls this market? Who wins if I lose? What does the fine print actually say? Not what I assume it says, because I'm tired and want to go home. What happened to the last 100 people who walked the same road before me? And why does no one ever ask them? This is not paranoia. This is preparation. Sun Tzu said the general who knows the enemy and knows himself will win 100 battles without danger. Translate that into your bank account, and it reads just as clearly. The man who understands the system he's operating inside and who understands his own weaknesses honestly cannot be easily robbed. Ignorance is not innocence. Ignorance is an open gate left unlocked in the dark, and someone is always waiting patiently on the other side of it. Consider the merchant families of old Venice. Before a single ship left port, they had already mapped the trade routes, studied which harbors demanded bribes, which captains could be trusted with cargo worth more than their own lives, and which competitors had been quietly buying loyalty from the dock workers. They did not sail on hope. They sailed on months of gathered intelligence, because a single miscalculation could sink not just a ship, but an entire family's fortune built across 3 generations. Now, compare that to how most people enter a mortgage today. A smiling agent, a monthly number that feels manageable, a signature given after 20 minutes of reading a document that runs to 40 pages. One approach is reconnaissance. The other is surrender dressed up as optimism. And the tragedy is that almost no one notices a difference until a bill comes due years later, disguised as an emergency that was never actually an emergency at all. Only the arrival of debt they were never shown clearly in the first place. The predator does not sign quickly. He does not confuse urgency created by someone else with urgency that is actually his own. He asks slower questions on purpose, because he understands that the party rushing him toward a decision almost always benefits from his haste far more than he ever will. This is why the predator treats every act now and every countdown timer with immediate suspicion rather than immediate excitement. Genuine opportunities rarely require you to decide before you can think. Manufactured urgency, on the other hand, depends entirely on you deciding before you can think, because thought is the one thing that reliably kills a bad deal before it closes. The scout who waits one extra day to confirm the terrain rarely loses the war over that single day. The soldier who charges forward the moment he is told to, without confirming anything, is the one whose name ends up on a list nobody reads afterward. Strategy 2. Never fight on the enemy's chosen ground. Debt is a battlefield the bank selected for you long before you ever arrived on it. Interest rates, minimum payments, credit scores. This is terrain built by someone else, engineered, so that you lose slowly while feeling at every step like you are winning. You get the car. You get the card. You get the small dopamine hit of the word, approved, appearing on a screen. And then you spend years fighting on ground that was never designed for your survival. It was designed with great care and considerable profit for your submission. The predator refuses to fight where he is structurally weak. If the enemy's strength is compounding interest, The predator builds his own compounding interest in his own investments quietly before he ever steps onto their field as a borrower. He asks a single reframing question that changes everything. Where is my actual strength, and how do I force the battle to happen there instead of where I'm expected to show up? This is precisely why the wealthy don't avoid leverage. They redirect it. They stop being the ground on which others build their fortunes, and they start building fortunes on ground that belongs entirely to them. Hannibal never attacked Rome where Rome was strongest. He crossed the Alps through terrain the Romans considered impassable and therefore left undefended, and he struck exactly where they were unprepared to receive him. He changed the battlefield instead of accepting the one handed to him by an enemy who assumed the mountains would fight on their behalf. That is the entire difference between a man who spends his evenings negotiating a slightly lower interest rate on a debt he shouldn't have taken in the first place, and a man who simply refuses to enter that arena at all, choosing instead to build assets on ground the bank has no claim over whatsoever. One man is haggling inside a cage. The other never walked into the cage to begin with. The young man at the kitchen table has been haggling his whole life. He negotiates his rent. He negotiates his car payment. He has never once asked whether the entire arena he keeps negotiating inside was built specifically to keep him negotiating forever, exhausted, and never quite free. There's a version of him, somewhere down a different path, who stops negotiating the terms of his own captivity and instead spends that same energy building an asset entirely outside the arena. Not a better interest rate, not a longer repayment plan, an entirely different battlefield, chosen deliberately, where the terrain finally favors him instead of the institution across the table. That single shift from negotiating inside someone else's cage to building outside of it entirely is worth more than a decade of skillful haggling ever could be. Strategy 3. The supply line is more important than the battle. Napoleon didn't fall in a single dramatic battle. He fell because the supply lines collapsed in the brutal expanse of the Russian winter, far from any cannon fire, far from any glory. Armies rarely starve on the battlefield. They starve on the march, quietly, in places nobody is watching, long after the applause of the last victory has faded. Your income is your supply line. Most people obsess entirely over the battle, the raise, the bonus, the big win, the promotion they've been chasing for years, while ignoring the slow, invisible bleed happening on the march, the subscriptions nobody remembers signing up for, the fees buried in statements nobody reads, the small leaks that nobody in their life has ever bothered to audit. A predator doesn't just ask how much comes in. He asks a colder, more useful question. What percentage of it actually survives the journey to reach me? Because an army that wins every battle but starves on the road still loses the war in the end, regardless of how many flags it captured along the way. And a man who earns brilliantly but bleeds quietly through 100 small, forgotten wounds is still poor. He is simply poor with better excuses, better clothes, and a more convincing story to tell at dinner parties. This is why the predator audits ruthlessly, not out of anxiety, but out of pure discipline. He treats every recurring charge as a small occupying force draining his territory month after month, unnoticed, until the accumulated sum becomes undeniable and by then has already cost him years. He doesn't ask, can I afford this? That question is designed by marketers to be answered emotionally, in the moment, when the answer is almost always yes. He asks instead, what does this actually cost in my long campaign over the next 10 years compounded? That single reframing changes behavior faster and more permanently than any budget ever could. Most men never perform this audit because it requires looking directly at something uncomfortable, the exact price of their own inattention. It is far easier to feel vaguely responsible while never checking the actual numbers than to confirm, in cold detail, exactly how much ground has quietly been surrendered. The predator forces himself to look anyway, on a fixed schedule without exception, because he understands that an enemy left unexamined for long enough eventually stops being a minor nuisance and becomes a reason the entire campaign fails. Strategy 4. Feints, patience, and the art of being underestimated. The wealthiest man in the room is rarely the loudest one in it. This is not humility. It is tactics, cold and deliberate. A predator who reveals the full extent of his strength invites resistance, invites jealousy, invites countermeasures from rivals who now know exactly what they're up against. A predator who appears smaller than he actually is moves through the world with dramatically less friction, and friction, over a long enough timeline, is the single greatest tax on any campaign. Machiavelli understood that appearing weak, or at the very least unremarkable, can be far more useful than appearing strong. Rivals do not prepare defenses against someone they don't perceive as a threat. This is why old money so often looks boring on the surface. Not because it lacks ambition, but because visibility itself is a cost, and the truly strategic mind refuses to pay costs it does not have to pay. Let the world underestimate you completely, while you quietly annex territory they never even noticed was on the map to begin with. There's a reason the most dangerous generals across history were rarely the ones parading their strength through the public square for applause. The ones who announced their power invited alliances to form against them almost immediately. The ones who moved quietly, methodically, without spectacle, annexed entire territories before anyone had organized a response worth mentioning. The same law governs money with equal precision. The neighbor showing off the new car in the driveway is rarely the one with the fortress balance sheet sitting quietly behind him. The fortress, more often than not, is hidden behind an unremarkable door in an unremarkable neighborhood, guarded by nothing more than the fact that nobody thought to look there. The young man at the kitchen table has been performing wealth his entire adult life without ever building any. He upgraded the car before he built the asset. He upgraded the apartment before he built the income to sustain it without strain. He has been announcing a strength he does not yet possess. And in doing so, he has been paying a visibility tax on a fortune that does not exist. The predator inverts this pattern entirely. He builds first and announces nothing, understanding that the moment his position is strong enough to withstand scrutiny, he will no longer need to announce at all. Genuine strength has never required a press release. It simply accumulates, quietly, until the day becomes impossible to ignore, and by then, the announcement has already made itself. Strategy 5. The decisive battle. Concentration of force. Weak generals spread their armies thin, attempting to defend everything simultaneously, and end up defending nothing particularly well. This is exactly what happens to people who chase 5 income streams, 3 business ideas, and a dozen investment trends all at once, hoping that something, somewhere, eventually sticks through sheer volume of attempts. Concentration of force wins wars. It has always won wars. One well-trained legion, deployed with total commitment at precisely the right moment, defeats 10 scattered battalions every single time history has recorded the comparison. The predator picks one battlefield, one skill, one asset class, one business, and throws overwhelming, undivided force at it until the outcome is no longer genuinely in question. Diversification has its place in any serious strategy, but that place comes after dominance has already been established, never before it. You cannot rationally defend an empire you never actually conquered in the first place. Alexander did not conquer the known world by attacking in every direction at once, hoping momentum would sort itself out. He committed his entire force to a single front, broke it completely and decisively, and only then moved on to the next. Compare that method to the man juggling 4 side hustles at 30% effort apiece, wondering with growing frustration why none of them have compounded into anything resembling a real result after years of scattered attempts. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from motion without direction, and it deceives people into believing they are working hard when in truth they are simply working scattered in every direction, gaining ground nowhere. The predator recognizes this trap early in his development. He would rather commit everything to one carefully chosen front and risk a single decisive failure than spread himself so thin that even eventual victory would feel indistinguishable from defeat. Concentration is not recklessness dressed up as boldness. It is a calculated refusal to dilute his own power into irrelevance. Strategy 6. The art of controlled information. Every court in history had its whispers, and every whisper moved gold before it ever moved armies. The predator understands something most people never think to question. Information is not neutral, and neither is silence. What you reveal, to whom, and when, shapes the battlefield just as much as any weapon you might carry into it. Machiavelli advised princes never to reveal their full intentions before the moment of action, because intentions announced too early give the enemy time to prepare a defense that would otherwise never have existed. The same principle governs a man's finances with uncomfortable precision. Announce your ambitions to a room full of people who have not yet built anything themselves, and you will find yourself surrounded almost immediately by quiet doubt disguised as concern, by unsolicited advice disguised as care, and by a dozen small discouragements that chip away at resolve before the plan has even had a chance to take its first step. The young man at the kitchen table once told everyone in his life about the business he intended to build. He told his friends. He told his family. He told co-workers he barely knew during lunch breaks, hungry for their approval before he had earned a single dollar from the idea. Within weeks, the doubt of a dozen well-meaning people who had never built anything themselves had settled into his own chest, disguised as their concern for his well-being. He mistook their comfort for wisdom, and the plan quietly died in a conversation. Never once in a marketplace where it might actually have been tested. The predator learns to hold his cards close, not out of paranoia, but out of respect for fragile early stages of any real campaign. He shares his plans only with those who have something meaningful to offer them: capital, expertise, access, and he builds in silence everywhere else, understanding that a plan spoken aloud too early to the wrong audience has already lost half its power before the first move is even made. Strategy 7. The long game of reputation. A predator understands that reputation is not vanity. It is infrastructure, built slowly over years and spent carefully over decades. Every promise kept, every debt honored, every deal closed with integrity becomes a brick in a fortress that eventually opens doors no amount of raw capital could open on its own. Every promise broken, every corner cut for a short-term convenience, becomes a crack in that same fortress, invisible for years until the exact moment it matters most, when it gives way entirely. The Medici family did not build one of history's great financial dynasties through capital alone. They built it through decades of carefully cultivated trust, extended patiently to merchants, princes, and popes alike, until their name itself became a form of currency that moved faster and further than gold ever could on its own. A letter bearing their seal was worth more in certain rooms than a chest of coins, because the reputation behind it had been built, brick by brick, across generations who understood that trust compounds exactly like interest, quietly, and often invisibly, until the day it is suddenly worth everything. Most people treat their word carelessly, assuming reputation is something that can be repaired instantly with an apology or a discount. The predator knows better. He treats every commitment as a small, binding contract with his own future self, understanding that the version of him who exists in 5 years will either benefit enormously from the discipline kept today, or will pay, with considerable interest, for the corners cut in a moment of convenience that felt harmless at the time. Strategy 8. Think in generations, not in quarters. Most men measure their progress in months. They check the account balance, feel a flicker of satisfaction or disappointment, and move on to the next month with the same short horizon still governing every decision they make. The predator measures in generations, because he understands that the truly great fortunes in history were never built by men chasing quarterly wins. They were built by men who planted trees they knew they would never personally sit beneath, understanding that the shade would eventually belong to someone else entirely, and choosing to plant anyway. This is the deepest cut Machiavelli makes into the comfortable assumptions of ordinary men. He observed that rulers who thought only of their own reign built fragile kingdoms that collapsed the moment they died, while rulers who thought in dynasties built structures that outlasted them by centuries. The difference was never talent. It was time horizon. A man planning for 1 year makes fundamentally different decisions than a man planning for his grandchildren, and those decisions compound in entirely different directions across the span of an entire lifetime. The young man at the kitchen table has never once considered what happens to his ledger after he is gone. He has thought about his next paycheck, his next vacation, perhaps his next 5 years if he is unusually disciplined for a man his age. He has never asked what structure, if any, would continue generating value for people he loves long after he can no longer personally manage it himself. This is not a failure of love. It is a failure of horizon, and it happens to be the single most correctable failure on this entire list, requiring nothing more than the willingness to ask an uncomfortable question most men spend their whole lives quietly avoiding. What happened to all of this today? I am no longer the one holding the ledger. Strategy 9. Occupation is harder than conquest. This is a lesson almost nobody teaches, And it happens to be the exact lesson that destroys a majority of people who finally, after years of effort, actually win. Taking territory is never the same as holding it. Rome did not fall because it failed to conquer new lands. It fell because it failed to govern competently and consistently what it had already taken decades earlier. The same collapse happens with almost mechanical predictability to men who make money quickly and lose it even faster. They won the battle of earning. They lost a far longer war of keeping. Once you take ground, once the money finally arrives after years of campaigning, the real test begins in earnest. Structure, protection, discipline. Systems built to hold what raw impulse would otherwise surrender back to the market within a single reckless month of celebration. The predator does not celebrate the conquest for long. He fortifies it almost immediately because he understands with total clarity that every empire has scavengers circling patiently the moment it appears unguarded even for a season. History is littered with lottery winners, professional athletes, and overnight founders who conquered a genuine fortune and lost the entire war within a decade. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because nobody had ever taught them the second half of the strategy. Winning the money was, in the end, the easy chapter. Governing it, protecting it, refusing to let sudden comfort dissolve the very discipline that built it in the first place. That is a chapter almost everyone skips entirely, and it is a chapter that ultimately decides everything that follows. Here is what nobody in polite company wants to admit out loud. The financial system was never neutral, and it was never designed to be. It was built by people who understood strategy at the deepest level, and it is used quietly and relentlessly against people who were only ever taught arithmetic in a classroom that had no interest in teaching them anything more dangerous than that. You were given a calculator and sent out onto a battlefield where the other side brought cartographers, historians, lawyers, and generals who have been refining their methods for centuries. This is not offered to you as an excuse to remain a victim of that arrangement. It is the exact opposite. It is the reason you must stop thinking like an accountant and start thinking like a strategist immediately, starting tonight. The moment you understand that every financial decision is a move on a much larger board, made by players who have already read the rules you were never shown. Something changes inside you permanently and does not change back. You stop asking, how do I save a little more this month? And you start asking a far more dangerous and far more useful question. Where exactly is the terrain, who currently holds it, and how precisely do I take it? There is a particular kind of grief that arrives with this realization, and it deserves to be named honestly rather than rushed past. For years, perhaps for your entire life up to this point, you believed the game was fair, or at least fair enough, and that belief made the losses easier to accept. Losing a fair game is simply bad luck. Losing a rigged game you never knew you were playing is something else entirely. And the moment that truth lands, most men feel something closer to anger than relief. Let it land anyway. Anger, aimed correctly and channeled into strategy rather than bitterness, has built more fortunes throughout history than optimism ever has. The predator does not waste his anger on the system itself, the way lesser men do, complaining endlessly about rigged rules while making no move to learn them. He converts that anger into precision. He stops asking why the game was built this way, a question with no useful answer, and starts asking how the game actually works, a question with an answer that can be studied, mapped, and eventually exploited to his own advantage. This conversion, from grievance to strategy, is perhaps the single most important shift a man can make in his entire financial life, and almost nobody teaches it, because almost nobody who profits from the current arrangement has any interest in you learning it. Machiavelli never promised that any of this would be comfortable. He promised only that it would be true, which is a rarer and more valuable gift than comfort has ever been. Fortune favors a prepared mind, never the merely hopeful one. The world does not reward good intentions, no matter how sincerely they are held. It rewards, without sentiment, those who read the map correctly and moved decisively before everyone else had even understood that a map existed at all. And once you see the board clearly, you cannot unsee it again, no matter how much you might wish to return to the comfort of not knowing. Every advertisement becomes a maneuver executed against your attention. Every limited time offer becomes a forced march designed to rush your decision before your own scouts have had time to report back with anything resembling the truth. Every friendly financial advisor becomes a figure whose incentives you now quietly verify before trusting a single recommendation they offer you with a warm smile. This is not cynicism for its own sake. It is simply what remains, clear and unadorned, once the comfortable illusions have finally been stripped away. The young man at the kitchen table is still staring at his notebook, but something in him has started to shift, almost imperceptibly. The way terrain shifts before an army even realizes the ground beneath it has changed. He is no longer just looking at numbers. He is starting, for the first time, to ask who benefits from him not understanding those numbers at all. That question, quiet and cold as it is the first real weapon he has ever picked up in his entire life. You were handed a household budget and told, with great confidence, that it was a strategy. It was never a strategy. It was a leash disguised carefully as a plan, and most people wear that leash for the entire span of their working lives, without ever once asking who tied the knot around their neck in the first place, or why it was tied so tightly. The men and women who build real, lasting wealth stopped managing money at some point and started commanding it instead. They stopped defending one small, exhausting patch of ground and started studying the entire battlefield laid out in front of them. They understood, often after painful experience taught them what theory alone could not, that every contract, every loan, every job offer, every opportunity presented with a smile is a move made by someone whose interest is not automatically aligned with their own. And instead of resenting that uncomfortable fact, the way most people do for their entire lives, they used it. They stopped being pieces moved across someone else's board and became players moving pieces of their own. Picture the young man from the kitchen table one more time, but picture him a decade from now. Two paths sit in front of him tonight, and the notebook cannot tell him which one he will choose. Down one path, he closes a video, feels a brief spark of inspiration, and returns tomorrow to the exact same terms, the exact same silence about his ambitions, the exact same scattered effort across too many fronts. 10 years pass. He is older, more tired, and the gap between his income and his expenses has barely moved, because the war was never actually fought. It was simply endured quietly 1 month at a time, until enduring became indistinguishable from living. Down the other path, something smaller but far more permanent happens tonight. He closes a notebook, not because he is finished, but because he has finally understood what the notebook was actually for. He begins to gather intelligence before his next commitment instead of after it. He stops fighting on ground chosen by other people. He watches a supply lines the way a general watches a map, not out of fear, but out of respect for the campaign ahead. He picks one front and commits to it fully, instead of scattering himself thin across 5 half-hearted attempts. He holds his plans close until they are strong enough to survive contact with people who have never built anything themselves. And slowly, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, he stops being a man reacting to his bank statement and becomes a man commanding a campaign of his own design. 10 years later, the two men look nothing alike, though they started at the very same kitchen table with the very same notebook and the very same gap between two numbers. The difference between them was never intelligence, and it was never luck. It was a decision made on one ordinary night to stop treating money like a math problem and start treating it like exactly what it has always been. So close this video and open your own ledger tonight while the feeling is still sharp. Not the tired one that only tracks what you spent last week on things you'll forget by next month. The one that honestly tracks what territory you're actually building, what ground you've been quietly bleeding on without ever noticing the wound, and what battle you've been carefully avoiding for years, because it always felt safer, in the moment, to simply stay small and call it contentment. The war was always happening around you, whether you chose to notice it or not. It did not pause simply because you were unaware of it. The only question that has ever actually mattered is whether you were fighting that war deliberately with a plan and map of your own, or simply being fought over quietly by people who read the terrain long before you ever thought to look at it. Decide tonight which one you intend to be. If this video shifted the way you see money, don't just scroll past it. Like this video, drop a comment telling me which strategy hit you the hardest, and subscribe, because every video on this channel is built to sharpen your mind and separate you from a crowd that stays comfortable. No fluff, no noise, just doctrine. Most people don't lose this game. They just never played it.